This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 303 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's about digital nomad life. Let me first pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording this podcast today in beautiful sunshine. Well, the sunshine's outside, of course. It's too noisy outside to record because there are birds and literally birds and bees, in fact, everywhere. So I'm here in my sunny office. So digital nomad life is the topic today, and I guess a quick definition I consider a digital nomad is someone who can work from anywhere via the internet. It's actually something I'd like to do more of in the future, especially once my son has finished school. I don't think I want to be permanently nomadic, but I would really love to maybe do a combination, so still do some face-to-face work, probably here in Perth or goodness knows where, but also be able to spend some longer stints abroad, somewhere interesting or somewhere new, while I'm also working. You know, that enables me to then spend weeks or months somewhere rather than have to return home to keep working. And it turns out I'm not alone. I've been following a bunch of digital nomads for quite some time, but I also had an interesting email in my inbox recently from the ADP Research Institute, which had surveyed a few thousand Australian workers, and their results were that 30% of Australian workers believe that they could relocate overseas, so go somewhere interesting and new, and still stay working for their current employer, which I found really interesting. And I think that COVID has definitely brought about a change in this. I think beforehand, most digital nomads would have been self-employed people, but thank you, pandemic, for some things. Perhaps now companies are aware that, you know, their employees can actually work from anywhere. So it's an interesting shift. Anyhow, we are going to be talking about digital nomad life for this whole episode, and I've got three guests today with really, really different perspectives. I'm really excited about how it's come together because it will give you lots of food for thought, I think, wherever you sit on the question of being a digital nomad. So I'll start with a very experienced digital nomad, and then I have someone who's just started doing some occasional digital nomad work, and then someone who lives in a digital nomad hotspot and isn't really sure that digital nomading is okay. So the full spectrum of opinions, I think. So first up, let me introduce Will Hatton. He's also known as the Broke Backpacker. So he's a blogger / digital nomad. I followed him online for a decade or so. And I started off by asking Will to give us a brief rundown on basically his life as a digital nomad and how he became this way and what he's been doing.
Yeah, so I first really hit the road when I was 19. I ended up having an injury I could no longer get into the army, which had been my plan. So I went to India and spent 2 years hitchhiking, couch surfing, picking up random jobs around India. I was traveling on $10 a day. And it was a really awesome experience. And I started writing bits and pieces out, and I had a mailing list of 30 people, didn't even have a website at this time. But I was positively reinforced by the people that I was sharing my writing with. And I was really going off the beaten track and doing India on an extreme budget and going to places that weren't covered. I didn't really know that travel blogging was a thing. I was aware of the Lonely Planet guidebooks, and that was pretty much it. There was travel bloggers around at that time, a few handful, some of the OG founders of the industry, I suppose, but I wasn't aware of them. When I did later become aware of them, the type of travel that they were covering wasn't accessible for somebody in my position. I was traveling with no money, right? And I was very willing to get out of my comfort zone and to be uncomfortable along the way. So I started my travel blog, which was the Broke Backpacker, 10 years ago in January this year. So 10 and a half years ago. And, I didn't know anything about blogging. I didn't know anything about building a website, but I had some success after a couple of years. And about 4-5 years in, we started hitting serious numbers. up to like 1.5 million users a month on the site. This was for a few reasons. It was partly because I was going to places like Venezuela, Iran, Pakistan, more rural areas of the Philippines that just hadn't been covered. And I was selling a lot of that, my stories and my experiences there, to big media publications like the BBC, Daily Mail, Nat Geo, which meant that I got some really fantastic backlinks from those sites, which helped my own trajectory. When I was in Pakistan, I was filming everything on Snapchat, and it just went like totally viral. And I asked my audience if anybody wanted to come on a tour with me to Pakistan, and put like a little PayPal link up, and went to bed. And the next day I woke up and it had like sold out. And I was like, oh, wow, okay. So I now made some money for the first time ever in my life. I'm going to invest that back into the blog. And I ended up leading tours around Pakistan for a while. I founded like a little guest house up there. But I tried a lot of different things on my online entrepreneurship journey. I've probably had about 20 different websites over the years. I've done a lot of affiliate marketing. I ran an SEO agency for a while where I was slinging links. I was drop shipping products from China, and that was going quite well until COVID ended up putting up shipping prices by like 400%. And it just like squeezed all of the profit out of those ventures. But the whole time it was really the broke backpacker that remained the engine that powered everything. That site today, we've got like 20 people working full time on the site. So it gets a lot of love, a lot of hours, a lot of content, frequently updated from all around the world. I think it's safe to say it's like one of the bigger travel sites out there, and certainly the biggest budget travel site. And we had a lot of success because we found that we were really pushing a style of travel that is accessible to anybody, but which really wasn't being promoted at the time. And there's a lot of benefits to traveling as a broke backpacker, namely that you really get to kind of peek behind the curtain and have more interactions with local communities, get a better feel for local culture. I mean, when you're hitchhiking, couch surfing, or wandering into a Sikh temple to get some free food, you meet people, you talk to people, and it's more of an exchange rather than staying in hotels or viewing things through a camera lens. So that's kind of a very short version of my quite long 10 years of online entrepreneurship.
Will actually now also has a physical business. He runs a hostel essentially targeting digital nomads in Bali, but we will speak about that on a future episode. I also, while we were chatting, asked him to give us some tips. So if you are an aspiring digital nomad, here are some of Will's ideas.
My top tips for prospective digital nomads, in no particular order, is to understand the difference between like following your passion and following the money. And you've got to have to think about what you want. I think that in the digital nomad space, the most visible form of digital nomad is the travel blogger or the influencer. And what you have to understand is that actually making it in that space is comparatively much harder than making it as a digital nomad in general. So let's say that you figure out a way to generate traffic for hammocks, and that you then drop ship hammocks from China to a fulfilled by Amazon warehouse, and you're selling $3,000 a hammocks a month, which enables you to live on the beach and to work 4 hours a week. I would very much argue that that is a more successful lifestyle than spending 40 hours a week on social media to make an unknown amount that is based entirely on the whims of a sponsored placement market. So I would say think very carefully about what path you want to go down on your digital nomad journey, because there's many, many options. I think it's also important for people to realize that it's probably going to take you 2 years before anything like really starts to happen. And you need to be consistent, and you need to be focused. You need to ensure that you're toppling the big business domino every day, and you're not just wasting your time on social media is the biggest sink for entrepreneurs that I've seen. I think it's also very important to try and find your tribe, to try and find people who are on a similar journey, because being an online entrepreneur can be a very lonely experience, which was my experience for much of my first few years of doing it. If you're around people who are living the same lifestyle, or trying to build the same kind of business, or trying to operate from the same value system of prioritizing freedom over like stability, maybe, it's just a very encouraging community to find yourself in, rather than being all by yourself. So I do think it's worth going to one of the digital nomad hubs like Chiang Mai or Madeira or Estonia or Bali, and finding your tribe, finding people who you can brainstorm with, share ideas with, ask questions, go to conferences. And I think it really is a learning curve where at first it can be pretty slow to gain some momentum, but you'll get to a point where you can just really take off if you continue to ask the right questions and to be proactive in seeking out people who can help you with your growth.
So there you go. And what you definitely will have noticed is that Will has always had a bunch of different ways to earn his money over the years. I think that kind of diversification pays off. I know that's certainly also paid off in my own business here in Perth. Now, my next guest today is Dara Brewton. So she's one of these new kind of digital nomads, and I think most like what I want to do or what I want to be like, I think, and kind of a becoming increasingly common for people to do this. So Dara is self-employed and a lot of her work can be done from anywhere. So she's just started taking advantage of that.
I started freelancing probably about 5 years ago. Before that, I worked for an ophthalmologist, a very different line of work. So now I freelance write and do voiceover and dabble in acting. This is the first time in my life that I haven't been beholden. I don't have to clock in somewhere. And so at first, I was still kind of getting up in the morning and working at my desk and kind of, because it's what you're used to. And then after a while, I was like, I don't have to stay here. I can just take my laptop. I can go wherever I want. I just take my laptop. And so then I started planning more travel. And so last year was the first time that I went for a long time because I don't know, it just didn't occur to me still that's okay to do.
I know, it sort of feels like you shouldn't be able to because there's all these other people going into the office or logging into the office 9 to 5 or 8 till 6 every day. And
you feel kind of mean, I don't know, I feel guilt for nothing. I mean, it's not I don't know, I didn't do anything, but people are like, oh, what did you do this summer? And I'm like, I went to Thailand for a month. I don't want to say it. And they're like, how did you get to do that? I was like, I mean, I worked while I was there. So it was it's the same as working here. I
worked
don't
there.
have to stay here. But so I'm trying to, this is my teenagers' last year of school. And so I was like, maybe I'm going to go for longer than a month. And so I'm trying to plan an extended trip where I just sort of go. And, well, obviously visas are involved. So you can't just, I'm going to stay here for a year, however long I can stay. But, and just kind of meander and just go wherever I want to go. And, wherever I'm allowed to go, I guess. So I'm just going to take the laptop and have some fun.
Yay. Have you got a starting point? Or which region of the world do you think you're going to start in?
Well, I was thinking I'll just go south, maybe Costa Rica, and then just kind of go down and around. Well, I have learned that it's substantially cheaper to fly outside of the U.S. or actually it's substantially cheaper to do most things outside of the U.S. The flight from Chiang Mai to Bangkok, because I had the round trip tickets to home from Bangkok, and we took a train. A sleeper train on the way there just because we wanted to. Yeah. It was obviously not the most efficient way to do that. But on the way back...
It's more sustainable though, so that's good.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. But we hopped a flight on the way back and it was $25. And that I kept telling everyone here, I was like, oh my gosh, do you know that I flew across the country for $25. I can't fly across the state of North Carolina for less than $200.
Yeah.
So the way that you can travel outside of the U.S. is much more budget friendly than inside the U.S. I saw this little cartoon I don't know 5 years ago or something, and it was just a little pencil drawing of a man looking at a bird, and it was imagine having wings and you could fly wherever you wanted to go. And then while I was looking at it, I was like, yeah, but that counts for people too. We can go wherever we want to go, so why are we just not? And so it kind of changed my whole mindset. We can go. You don't have to stay at home just because you should, I'm trying to get rid of should out of my vocabulary because who makes those rules? There's no rules.
Absolutely. Life's too short to be beholden to the ophthalmologist or, wherever you're working.
I mean, and obviously, I'm speaking from a place of privilege, right?
Of course, yeah.
Not everybody works from their laptop and can take it with them. But, I'm basically kind of speaking to myself because I was working from my laptop for a while before I realized, hey, you can go. Like, it's allowed. No one's like, you're the adult here. You get to choose.
I love that. A reminder that we do get to choose exactly what we want to do, especially if, like I do, we have the privilege to do so. Now, speaking of this combination of things, my next guest is Chris Christou, and he moved to Mexico initially to work from there, thinking he might move on. But during his time there, living in Oaxaca and researching more deeply, thinking and, philosophizing even, it has led him to some other ideas about digital nomadism, which I think are really worth thinking about as well. So here's Chris.
I moved down to Oaxaca from Toronto, Canada, which is where I was born and raised about 8 years ago. And, at that time, there was much less digital nomadism at the time. And my choices for arriving were generally much different from most people. It was a combination of escapism and chocolate.
It's a great reason. Tell me more about that.
For the 2 previous years before I decided to move down to Oaxaca, I was working for a chocolate company out of Toronto, and very much involved in the kind of philosophical aspects of it. If that makes sense. I mean, we were talking about things that don't seem to traditionally be related to chocolate, but that have these kind of deep threads within the history, such as interculturality, ceremony, you could say, tradition. And so I decided I was going to move to Oaxaca, and part of that comes from this long history in my life, at least for the decade of my 20s, where I was a part-time backpacker or semi-permanent tourist. I caught the travel bug very young, around 20, and I basically for the next 8 or 10 years worked to travel. So I would work as much as I could in the shortest amount of time possible, save as much money as possible, and travel for as long as I possibly could. And after half a decade, after 8 years, I started to really question what I was doing with my life in regards to this kind of very transitory, temporary outlook on my life and the world. And so I was very lucky to have been gathered in by this chocolate organization in Toronto. After I already had this understanding that I was going to move somewhere permanently as a way of kind of stopping this runaway train of wanderlust and movement. And so I decided on Oaxaca. And the company that I was working for, that I still work for from time to time, they were very, very generous and said, we have some producers, some cacao and coffee producers in southern Mexico. We'd love it if you would work for us and work on the regeneration projects that we have going on with these communities. And so when I arrived in Oaxaca, I thought, okay, this is the first place among many on a long list that I could go to, and we'll just see what happens. But after about 6 months, I realized that I just needed to stop being everywhere. I needed to stop being anywhere. Just needed to plant myself and root myself. And here I am 8 years later. And so this combination of being able to work with small scale producers and indigenous communities here in southern Mexico. And I knew that I wanted to write a book on travel, but I just knew that I didn't want it to be another travelogue, just another journey into me, into the self, into, this glorification of the self that so often arises in the world of travel, especially tourism more so. And so I began investigating the history of tourism because I had moved to a tourist destination and I started working in the tourism industry. So I began to see all of these kind of hidden aspects that I couldn't see as a backpacker, as a tourist, from the other side, seeing the consequences of not just the movements of the people who I met on the tours and things like that, but also realizing that, that was very much my consequence as well in the previous decade. This kind of manner of going to a place for a few days or week or a month and not once asking myself, what was my consequence in this place? And a lot of that came to arise not only from working in the industry here, but also these investigations into the history of tourism and in the kind of, if you considered it, reflected upon it long enough, you'd realize, well, the truth of the matter is that we would have a very difficult time understanding our level of consequence in a place if we were only there for a few days or a week or a month, because of course that consequence kind of rolls out afterwards. So I did during this time meet a lot of digital nomads here in Oaxaca, and maybe you know this, maybe your listeners know this, but Oaxaca has become very much a hotspot, Mexico City and Oaxaca, for expats and digital nomads in the last 2 years since we could say the end of the lockdowns. So there's been this massive kind of rise in, for lack of a better word, temporary living situations here in Oaxaca, and of course in many other places, especially since the end of the lockdowns. And this has caused a great deal of issues, we'll say, for lack of a better word, among local peoples, in the context of Airbnb, gentrification, digital nomadism. Some of the consequences of digital nomadism is that not only can people in that context go wherever they want, assuming there's, relative accommodation for them, Wi-Fi, I imagine, internet, but that the willingness to keep moving to other places creates this understanding, perhaps subconscious, perhaps unconscious, that these places are temporary. And therefore the people within them are also temporary. And so after many years of meeting people like this in Oaxaca, and, people who came and they would say, "Oh, how long have you been here?" And "You've been here 5 years." Like, "Wow, you must love it. And this is just, it's so amazing, so beautiful, this place." And because they were just seeing the surface of a place. And of course, in tourist destinations, those particular spots or locales within the destination, whether it's the historic center or the downtown, are often dolled up in order to hide whatever's below it. And so people would say like, "Oh, yeah, it's so beautiful. I love this place so much." And, after 2 weeks and 3 weeks, and after a while, a kind of relative sense of malaise in those conversations coming from me, where I would think, and I wouldn't say this to people, but I would think, come back and talk to me in 6 months. And in many, many instances, those people weren't even there 6 months later. So then you understand even yourself, like for me, for example, not even as a Oaxacan born person, but someone who's decided to create a permanent life here, that you are also seen, again, consciously or otherwise, as temporary. And so how do you build friendships? How do you build relationship? Not just with other people, but of course with the place, and the measure and glorification of digital nomadism, of wanderlust, can produce this dynamic wherein places and people are not just temporary, but also disposable.
So super interesting talking to Chris. It made me think that especially the digital nomad hubs that are, well known amongst digital nomads around the world, the Chiang Mai's, the Bali, the various other places, Oaxaca, of course, as well. Perhaps they're suffering from a form of over-tourism and maybe an over-digital nomadism. And perhaps in my future, when I try and do some digital nomading, maybe I'll call it something different, but perhaps it's better to focus on other places. And I think that's actually kind of what I already had in mind, like, returning to Osaka in Japan and spending a few months based there and, wandering the world a little bit. Anyway, it gave me really good food for thought, so I hope it did for you as well. And I've got some more interesting tidbits from my conversation with Chris for future episodes. So, thank you very much for listening to episode 303 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I actually have a special quick shout out this week. I am shouting out to listeners in Taiwan. For a long, long time, I have seen as, much more than should be expected a number of downloads from people in Taiwan. And this week, you Taiwanese people people in Taiwan downloaded more episodes than any other country except for the US. Obviously, the US is much bigger, but even ahead of my home country of Australia. So I'm trying to find my Taiwanese listeners to find out more about you. You're not in my Facebook group. I suspect Facebook is not used widely there. But message me somewhere if you are listening to this from Taiwan. Maybe find me on Instagram at Amanda Kendall or LinkedIn or anywhere. I'm desperately seeking my Taiwanese listeners. This week it was, listeners, hundreds of listens and downloads from like 20 different cities across Taiwan. So it's not just, I don't know who you all are and I want to know. So please satisfy my curiosity. Anyway, a big thank you to all my guests. Let me give you some more info about them. I first up chatted with Will Hatton, the broke backpacker, and you can find out more about Will and find some links to his hostel in Bali as well at thebrokebackpacker.com. I then chatted with Dara Brewton. She writes for travelnest.com. And finally, I chatted with Chris Christou. Now, Chris actually has an amazing podcast called The End of Tourism Podcast. So you can find his website at theendoftourism.com or just search for The End of Tourism Podcast in wherever you're listening to this podcast. Super interesting interviews. Highly, highly, highly recommend. If you want to hear some more about kind of digital nomad ideas, I have done one earlier episode way back in early 2019. We called it Location Independent Work. That is episode 134. Of course, don't forget to come and join my either Facebook group or LinkedIn groups for thoughtful travellers. Always lots of interesting discussions going on there. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in either platform, or you can find the links in the show notes. For this episode, you can find those show notes at notaballerina.com/303. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.